Hey everyone, welcome to episode 32 of Trucksafe Live, the show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon, this is Rob. We are with Trucksafe, which is dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Welcome everyone. Looks like we got a lot of folks in the various places where we are streaming, so good to see you all, have you all here with us. Say hey in the comments if you're around. So we know who's here, and as always, as we go along, if you have any questions or thoughts, particularly for this topic, which is drug and alcohol testing, misnomers, myths, and lies, we're interested in what are some of the most prevalent issues or misconceptions you all deal with when it comes to drug and alcohol testing. This comes on the heels of an article that we published on our website, trucksafe.com, last week, having to do with applicability or non-applicability to of drug and alcohol testing regulations to student drivers, CDL student drivers. And I thought it would make a good topic for discussion today. So I'm glad to have Rob here with me. Rob, what's going on in your world?
Not a whole lot. Just putting together myths, misnomers, and outright lies about drug testing. So
Rob sent me a list of like 25 of these. I had prepared like 5 of them, and then Rob sends me an email last night. He's got like 25 of them, so he's ready to roll.
Well, you get these from the driver world. Drivers used to just sit around, and you hear the craziest things from truck drivers, and sometimes, and it's like, hey, I heard this, and we can't do this anymore. So some of those I added in there just because I know a lot of it floats around the truck driving realm.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of them. So looking forward to tackling those. Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about some things going on over at Trucksafe. First up, as always, if you're not a part of our Trucksafe Fleet Compliance Network, make sure you join. It's free to join. You can find it at trucksafenetwork.com. You can also download the app on the App Store or the Google Play Store. This is a social network for fleet safety professionals to get together, learn from one another, ask questions, and also have access to all of our content that we put out frequently on DOT compliance issues, videos, articles, podcasts, everything like that. So check it out, trucksafenetwork.com. What else we got going on at Trucksafe? Rob, I know you've been working on a lot of things for various clients here over the last couple of weeks. Maybe
Crash.
worth highlighting some of those. Yeah, what's the deal with the crashes that you got going on?
I did a post today on crash preventability program. So we're doing a lot of those, and it's the typical run around. You got to run around and hunt down police reports and crash reports and videos and all kinds of stuff. So besides that, it's just the norm.
Crash preventability, it's an important thing to do if you're not doing it. We've talked on other shows about kind of the program that FMCSA has set up for motor carriers to challenge the preventability of certain accident categories that they have deemed eligible for that type of program. But if you're not taking advantage of that program right now, you should be, because it can significantly influence your crash indicator score, one of your 7 basics in your CSA score. So Rob's working with some of our clients now on doing those on their behalf. So certainly if that's something you have trouble with or need help with, you can reach out to us and reach out to Rob, and he'll get it done for you. Also doing a lot of safety rating upgrade work. I know you've been working on that type of stuff. So
yeah, I think I'm kind of all over the place right this moment. You got a lot going on.
We do. Anyway, give us a ring if you need any help, if there's anything we can do to help you, and we will be happy to. Other than that, some recent Trucksafe content that we've put out, like I said, one of which is kind of spurring this particular show. You can check out these articles on our website, like I said, trucksafe.com. Also, if you subscribe to our newsletter, you will get these delivered right to your email inbox. We're always putting out articles on the latest DOT compliance issues. So the most recent one, one of the most recent ones that we did was this one on drug and alcohol testing for student drivers, where we break down exactly what the FMCSA's current thoughts seem to be with respect to the applicability of drug and alcohol testing for CDL drivers. Spoiler alert. Student drivers are subject to drug and alcohol testing, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Some other things going on in the industry also highlighted on our website. I saw this come through. It's probably been a couple of weeks ago now. FMCSA is issued a final rule making some changes to their broker and freight forwarder financial responsibility rules. So they're not changing the amount. So it's still a $75,000 surety bond that is required to maintain your broker or freight forwarder authority, but they are changing some things, notably the things that you as a broker or freight forwarder have to have available as essentially collateral for your surety bond to make sure that you're good for the money that if folks are collecting on your bond, and then also some additional protections or automatic things that happen if your surety bond is drawn down below the minimum $75,000 requirement, including potential suspension. So be sure to check that out if you are a broker or freight forwarder. Pretty important changes there. Again, you can check that out on our website, trucksafe.com. Rob, did you see those changes? Did you have any thoughts? You used to run a brokerage.
I did, and I thought for sure that it would go higher, but I mean, I feel like it should. I think when I started, it was like $10, and then it was went up to 75,000. We all thought it was going to put all the little guys out of business, and you have places like Pacific Coast Financial and stuff like that that'll charge you, a couple $1,000 a year, and you don't have to put up anything. So, you go out of business, and how do carriers get paid? So I think it's a big problem, but
yeah,
what the solution is, it's not leaving it at 75,000. So
yeah. The thing that they didn't do, which is not surprising, is address the issue of double brokerage at all, which seems to have become an increasingly big problem in the industry. But they didn't do anything about it with this particular rulemaking. We knew that they weren't going to do anything about it because it wasn't in the notice of proposed rulemaking that they issued last year. But regardless, still haven't tackled that particular issue. So no relief in that regard yet. Okay, what else is going on in the industry? The only other thing, it's been a pretty quiet last month or so.
Scary
compared to summertime where we saw a bunch of rulemaking activity. So it's a little bit quiet over the last couple of months. But one thing to keep in mind, if you're a motor carrier that uses your portal account to update your DOT registration information or access your CSA scores or access the clearinghouse, all those things that you could do through the portal. FMCSA issued a notice a few weeks ago about changes to their security, web security platform. So now you're going to, in order to continue logging on to your portal account beginning December 1st, so the end of this week, you're going to have to create a login.gov account, and then you're going to have to use that to access your portal account. This is a multi-factor authentication type system that the U.S. government has in place to secure accounts. So if you don't get that set up by the end of this week, you're not going to have access to your portal account anymore, and you're going to be up the creek potentially. So make sure you do that. That's coming up here in a couple days. Did you see that post I posted, Rob, about the tweet that FMCSA? So yesterday, I think it was yesterday. It was hilarious to me, probably to nobody else. But
IT security, and then they posted some trash that they
FMCSA's official Twitter account. They have one post, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, one post about this cracking down on web security, and then the very next post they have is either they got hacked or somebody who runs their social media accounts mistakenly posted on the FMCSA account, not their personal account, some nonsense about something unrelated to transportation. I just thought that was hilarious and pretty typical of federal government. But anyway, neither here nor there. All right. So that's all that's really going on in the industry from a DOT compliance perspective. We're still waiting on some updates for the big rule makings that are going to be happening. Some of them are rules, some of them are not really rules, but they are still going to impact carriers pretty significantly. And those are potential changes to the safety rating process. We've had other shows about that. A significant overhaul to CSA scores and how those are calculated. That is still coming. And then also potential changes to the data queue system and setting up some kind of an independent appeals board. So those are all big things that are coming down the pike at some point. I think probably in December we will have kind of a year-end review and then also a 2024 outlook show here on Trucksafe Live. So be sure to tune into that if you want to know more about kind of the significant rule makings that happened this year and what we can expect for regulated motor carriers next year. So
We've got speed limiters, right? 29th of December.
Is that when it's anticipated?
I think so.
Yeah, speed limiters seems like it's always kind of sitting out there, and then it just never really comes to be. But that sounds about right. I can't remember what the current status is.
I looked at the date this morning. I'm thinking, oh man, we got 30 days till speed limiters happens.
But that'll be just for newly manufactured trucks, I think, right? It won't be any retrofitting for existing trucks. So don't buy any new trucks if you're worried about that. Apparently. Okay, anyway, so moving on then to segue into today's topic, again, titled Drug and Alcohol Testing Misnomers, Myths, and Lies. Like I said, it stems from some content we put out over the last couple of weeks in response to some questions we'd received on the applicability or the inapplicability of the federal drug and alcohol testing rules to drivers enrolled in CDL schools. For whatever reason, that particular topic gained some interest over the last month or so. So we wanted to tackle that head on with our detailed article on the topic on our website. But it did get me thinking about some other questions or misunderstandings that tend to arise in this context. And so I thought it would be a good idea, a good forum to address those other issues all in one place, try and dispel some of the most common myths that we hear. And so that's what we're going to do on today's show. Like I said, Rob and I have both independently developed our own common misunderstandings. I've got 5, Rob's got 25. So this is going to be the Rob show today. But common misunderstandings in the drug and alcohol testing context. And so we're going to work our way through those. Rob, I'm going to let you kick things off with the first one on your list.
All right, I'm not going to start with the first one. I kind of highlighted some on my list, but we're gonna float through them. I think one of the biggest ones that I get is there is guidance from the CSA that says CDL holders, but who has to be queried in the clearinghouse? So CDL holders, it's ultimately up to the company, the carrier, to decide whether they're going to do holders. But generally it's reserved for equipment. So if you are a CDL holder, but you operate CDL equipment, you must be queried at the time of hire and then annually. So that's what the regulations say, but there's that big myth out there that says that all holders have to be queried, and that's not really true. So that was the big one that I think gets some people.
Yeah, in other words, if you hold a CDL, but you are employed by a carrier to only operate a vehicle that doesn't require a CDL, the mere fact that you hold a CDL is not what necessitates a clearinghouse query. It's whether you are operating or whether there is a reasonable expectation that you're going to operate a CDL size vehicle for that particular carry that necessitates the query.
Yeah.
And that's true even of drug and alcohol testing in general. I mean, that's a common myth too, is that, hey, if I'm employing drivers that happen to hold CDLs, even though I'm only requiring them to operate smaller vehicles that don't require a CDL, then I still have to drug test them because they got CDLs. It's just not the case. What matters is, are they going to be operating vehicles that require a CDL for you or not? And if not, then you're not subject to drug and alcohol testing. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, vehicle focus, equipment focus, not license focus necessarily.
Yeah. What about mechanics and non-traditional drive? Folks who may occasionally jump in a truck to test drive it. Mechanics are the classic example, but maybe you've got a manager or something who occasionally jumps in a vehicle. I know that's kind of a related issue, but what's the deal with those folks?
Well, we actually we had this come up recently, but so generally you've got, we have mechanics that don't have CDLs that are operating 10 to 26 1,000 pound vehicles. So obviously that's not clearinghouse related, but anybody that's operating 26,001 plus pound vehicles on the public highway for any reason. I mean, there's obviously the regulation aspect of it that they have to have the query at the time of hire, and they have to be qualified generally, not just by drug and alcohol, but the overall compliant, qualification compliance piece. But there's the highway exposure, highway litigation exposure piece as well. So if you have this mechanic that's out there test driving, you don't know that the regulation covers them, that they have to be qualified to drive for whatever reason they're out there on the highway driving your truck, and they get in an accident, that's going to be a problem for you. I think I post earlier in the week about this because it popped up, but um, company had a mechanic that was operating, just moving a class 8 truck from a road tractor by itself from one place to the next, and hadn't know anything, not even a license on file. So yeah, if they're going to
And it
operate
only
it,
takes one trip.
that's it.
Literally, the first time you're out on a public highway in a vehicle that requires a CDL, you better have a CDL, and you better be enrolled in the drug and alcohol testing program, or that's a violation. First time is violate. There's no de minimis exception or anything like that. Nothing like that. So, and the other thing to point out, this kind of goes along with a misnomer as well. Could be an independent one in its own right, but is a lot of folks are under the misunderstanding that the federal drug and alcohol testing rules are only applicable to interstate commerce. And I won't fault you for that understanding, because that's typically how it works with the other safety regulations. When we're talking about the federal hours of service rules, for example, those only apply to interstate commerce. But the CDL requirements and the drug and alcohol testing requirements are distinct from all other categories of the safety regulations, not just because of the weight applicability of them, but also because they apply to both interstate and intrastate commerce. It doesn't matter if you are only engaged in intrastate commerce. If you're operating a vehicle that's more than 26,000 pounds, or hauling a placardable quantity of hazmat, or a bunch of passengers, 16 or more passengers, you're going to need a CDL, and you're going to be subject to drug and alcohol testing, like I said, even if you're engaged in intrastate commerce. So there's your bonus, your bonus misunderstanding there. Let's see. Somebody's asking a question here. Jill is asking, what is a safety-sensitive job? Is it only driving? Jill, you're in luck, because I went ahead and pulled up the regulation here, so we can just read it together. Safety-sensitive function is defined in the regulations, section 382.107, to mean, again, this is always the case, but they FMCSA likes to use like 1,000 words when they could have gotten it done in like 100. So here we go. I'm going to read it off. Safety-sensitive function means all time from the time a driver begins to work or is required to be in readiness to work until the time he or she is relieved from work and all responsibility for performing work. Safety-sensitive functions shall include all time at an employer or shipper plant, blah, 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 or any public property waiting to be dispatched unless the driver has been relieved from duty by the employer, all time inspecting equipment, all time spent at the driving controls of a commercial motor vehicle in operation, all time other than driving time in or upon the CMV, except time spent resting in the sleeper berth, all time loading or unloading a vehicle, supervising or assisting in the loading, blah, 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 all time repairing, obtaining assistance, or remaining in attendance upon a disabled vehicle. These various examples that they're giving here are largely tracking what constitutes on-duty time within the hours of service regulations. But the key takeaway here, and the way that I always view it, and Rob, I'm interested in your thoughts on this too, is what really matters when we're talking about a safety sensitive function is driving time. It's driving. That's going to be the primary safety sensitive function, but it can include tangential stuff, including like inspecting equipment, stuff like that. But far and away, the most common thing that is going to be considered a safety sensitive function is driving time.
No, I agree. And I think one place where it kind of goes off the hinges is dispatchers. A big question that we've always had, or that we have from carriers, is, are dispatchers considered safety sensitive roles?
Yeah.
And, there's different organizations in the government. So you have, DOT, FAA, FMCSA, and and under some of those, a dispatcher is considered safety sensitive.
Yeah.
So it just depends on what organization you're operating under, whether they classify dispatchers as or crew as safety sensitive. So
One of the main reasons this term is important in this context is that if a driver fails or refuses a DOT required drug or alcohol test, then the implication, the result of that is that they are prohibited from performing safety sensitive functions unless and until they go through the return to duty process. So the obvious answer is if I'm a driver that tests positive or I refuse a required test, then I'm not going to be able to drive anymore. One question that comes up that I haven't looked at in a while, but it does occasionally come up, that's an interesting kind of question is, if I'm a CDL driver who tests positive for drugs or alcohol on a DOT test, now I'm prohibited from performing a safety sensitive function. Am I prohibited from driving any class of vehicle or just a CDL size vehicle? Am I permitted to operate a non-CDL vehicle if I'm in prohibited status in the clearinghouse? Rob, let's put your knowledge to the test here.
that's going to be, I don't know on this one. I would say no, because for non-CDL, you're not subject to drug and alcohol. So if we're 10,001 to 26,000 in one, you're not subject to you're subject to all regulations except drug and alcohol testing. So
Yeah.
I would say yes.
Yes, that they are allowed to operate those vehicles.
Yes. In a prohibited status from we're
I think it's the opposite. I think the answer is no, based on this definition of safety sensitive functions. We're just doing this off the cuff, by the way. This
yeah,
requires some analysis and some digging in. But I think the answer is no. I think safety sensitive functions is broad enough to encompass driving even a commercial motor vehicle that does not require a CDL. So I think if you test positive for drugs or alcohol on a DOT test, you're not even allowed to operate a non-CDL vehicle if it's a commercial motor vehicle. So 10,000 to 26,000 pounds until you go through the return to duty process. Like I said, I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've looked at that, but that has been my understanding.
I'm going to bet on that.
Okay, let's
Bet you're right.
No, let's bet on it, and then well, anyway, in any event, we're going to put an article together after we do this show on our website, and we'll clarify that. We'll figure out what the actual answer is. Okay, so that was the first one. Let's see. Let's hit one of mine here. So, I'm going to start with the one that kind of prompted this entire show, which is a misnomer, or not a misnomer, but a misrepresentation that students enrolled in a truck driving school are not subject to drug and alcohol testing. I've heard folks say that, and turns out it's just not the case. FMCSA has been pretty clear over the years that student drivers, assuming they have a CLP, a commercial learner's permit, are in fact subject to drug and alcohol testing. In fact, they've got guidance that says specifically that available on their website. I think where the disconnect comes in here is the regulations use of the term employer in this context. So in other words, it's clear that student drivers are, again, assuming they have a CLP, are subject to drug and alcohol testing. I think the more pertinent question is who's responsible for actually administering those tests. Because if you just got a driver that's working for a carrier, it's clearly the carrier's responsibility to have that driver enrolled in a drug and alcohol testing program. But what if it's a CDL school? They're not the legal employer usually of those student drivers. And so who is it that administers the test? Whose random pool are they in? Who's doing the pre-employment test? Stuff like that. That's the more pertinent question. And that's where it starts to get confusing. That's why our article is as long as it is on this topic, because I think even FMCSA confuses themselves on the answer to this question, because they used to have one stance probably 10 years ago, suggesting that it was the school's obligation in those situations to test those drivers. But nowadays, based on from what I can tell, the FMCSA's current stance on this is that it is the student's responsibility, the CDL student's responsibility, to make sure that they themselves are complying with the drug and alcohol testing rules. And where I'm gathering that that is the FMCSA stance is from an administrative appeal that was filed and tried by the FMCSA, I think in 2019. Their published opinion is available. It's cited in that article that we put out on our website, where they kind of go through the analysis. It's like a 20-page analysis where they're breaking down their regulations and how they think they apply. Long story short, FMCSA in this context, drug and alcohol testing, is taking a different view of what the term employer means than they do in all of their other regulations. So normally when we're talking about safety regulations like hours of service and vehicle maintenance and stuff like that, the regulations use the term employer in terms of who's responsible for managing those things. But they define that term employer very broadly in their non-drug and alcohol testing regulations. So in Part 390. They define it to include even like independent contractors. Essentially what it comes down to in that context, the non-drug and alcohol context, is it's the motor carrier under whose DOT number the work is being done that is responsible for ensuring that drivers are complying with hours of service and doing the pre-trip inspections and stuff like that. Those burdens rest squarely on the shoulders of the entity whose DOT number is being used. So if you're using logic, you would think that that same analysis should apply to drug and alcohol testing. So if I look at the student driver situation, it's the school's DOT number that those operations should be conducted under, because who else would have a DOT number in that situation, unless it's a motor carrier that has set up their own school or something like that. Somebody's DOT number has to be used to operate these vehicles on public highways. So it's most often going to be the CDL schools. And in my view, it should follow then that because the students are operating the vehicles under the DOT number of the school and under their control, essentially, that the school should be responsible for the drug and alcohol testing, just like they would be responsible for hours of service and vehicle maintenance and stuff like that. But it turns out FMCSA doesn't view it that way. They take a more narrow view of the term employer in the drug and alcohol context and say that what they mean in that context is legal employer. And because the schools aren't the legal employer, they're not paying wages to these drivers, then they're not responsible for drug and alcohol testing. And so like I said, long story short, FMCSA says it's the student's problem. Well, that creates practical issues, obviously, because how if I'm a CDL student, how do I discharge my obligations to make sure that I'm being tested and that I'm in a random pool and that I go through a pre-employment test, stuff like that? How do I do that? And my thought on it is that practically it's probably just not happening very often. Unless you've got a school that's really on the ball here and making sure that their students are doing this on their own, it's probably just these students are probably just slipping through the cracks. That's not to say there aren't, like I said, some schools that are kind of on the ball here, because FMCSA does leave open the possibility that says, hey, even though it's the student's responsibility, the CDL school could essentially serve as a third-party consortium for those students. So those students could enroll in that third-party school's consortium, and then the school would manage it on their behalf. But ultimately, the burden falls on the students. I hope that makes sense. I tried to dumb it down as best as I could, but FMCSA is doing you guys no favors by overcomplicating this. Rob, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, they actually put out guidance in January 2022. It was basically called Student Driver Role Aid. And in that, they spell out, if you're enrolled in an independent CDL training program, you basically are self-regulated as a student. So you have to designate your own TPA. You have to purchase your own query plan, since TPAs cannot purchase a query plan. And then you have to query yourself in the clearinghouse and under your own account, or get your TPA to do it. Unless you're enrolled in an employer-based CDL training program, and then it all falls under the employer. But as a student of an independent CDL training program, you're largely self-regulated. So it's like I don't know how we've we've gotten to the point to self-regulate drivers,
It,
but especially student drivers. So
yeah, my fear is if students are enrolled in a CDL school that is just taking the hands-off approach, saying, "Hey, it's not my responsibility, so good luck to you,"
yeah,
and then the students aren't doing it themselves, well, then we've potentially got a big universe of student drivers out there operating on public highways who have not been drug or alcohol tested, which seems like a problem to me.
yeah,
This is that guidance or one place where that guidance that Rob was mentioning lives. This is in the clearinghouse. But this is also referenced in that article that I mentioned that we put on our website. If you're interested in the full analysis of this, check it out on our website, trucksafe.com. But like I said, long story short, CDL students, again, assuming they have a CLP, are indeed subject to drug and alcohol testing. And then the question is, who is going to be doing that for them? And regulations just put it on the shoulders of the students themselves. Practically, how it should work is that the CDL school should be setting themselves up as a third-party administrator and should be doing it on behalf of their students to make things easy and to make sure things aren't slipping through the cracks is really how it should work. Let's see here. We got some comments. Matt says, I agree. The logic is that likely the only driver's license held at all is the CDL. The impact is on the CDL, thus would trickle down to operation of other. Oh, he's going back to that situation of, is a driver who tests positive for drugs or alcohol on a DOT test going to be prohibited from operating any CMV, regardless of whether it requires a CDL? Sorry, I missed that earlier, Matt.
I think where my mindset goes with that is, we had a couple DOT numbers that were operating in Colorado. So, obviously you have marijuana everywhere, dispensaries everywhere, anything you want, anywhere you want to get it. And what we had was a portion of that, maybe 40% were non-DOT drivers. So we're operating still CMVs, 10,001 plus, but they're not subject to drug and alcohol testing. Yep. So we eventually started a non-DOT program for oral fluid testing for non-DOT drivers, even though we didn't have to. We did it from a policy perspective. And what we found was probably 20% of our workforce was driving our non-DOT vehicles high as gas most of the time. Man. So it was kind of that, well, they're not regulated. Obviously, from our policy perspective, we're not going to continue to employ them. But that was kind of where my mind was going with that is, if you were to not have tested for that DOT program, that DOT test, would it matter? Yeah. So that's where my mind goes to.
Well, and a related note, I mean, how is this even going to get caught, right? Because if I'm hiring that driver to operate a non-CDL required vehicle, I'm not required to run a clearinghouse query on him. So I'm not going to know necessarily that he's in prohibited status. Now, the regulations address that by saying, I still have to ask him questions about that on the application, and assuming he's truthful, which he would never be. If that's your situation and you've tested positive, are you going to answer no to that or yes to that question on the application if you're trying to get a job? No. So, but that's how the regulations purport to deal with that situation. Is they expect those carriers to be asking their drivers that question, and the driver should be answering honestly. And if they do, then that driver would not be qualified to operate the vehicle, I think is how it is supposed to work. But you could very easily see how this just slips through the cracks because of dishonesty.
Yeah, it's kind of like the hours of service deal for short haul. You're still it says in the regulation you can work 14 hours, but you still can't drive more than the regulation says. So, but there's nothing in the regulation for short haul that says you have to differentiate drive time from anything else. Exactly. So they don't know.
So how's it ever going to get caught?
Yeah. So it's the same thing.
Same thing. Yeah. Tom on LinkedIn is saying, I think he's referring back to the situation with student drivers being responsible for complying with the drug and alcohol testing regulations. He says, "Isn't that similar to a single unit independent owner operator?" I think that's right, Tom. I think that's FMCSA's intention. For what they call owner operators, I hate how they use that phrase in their clearinghouse guidance. When they refer to an owner operator, when FMCSA refers to an owner operator, they're talking about a guy or a girl that has their own DOT number and is operating just a single truck. That's not historically how the industry views owner operators. Owner operators can be leased operators who are leasing on to another motor carrier and operating under their DOT number. I would say that's the more common situation. And in those situations, it's the leased carrier that is responsible for administering the drug and alcohol testing rules, just like that's their own driver. But I think you're right, Tom. I think for what the FMCSA considers a true owner operator, it requires them to enroll in a consortium and then have that consortium make reports and do queries on them and stuff through the clearinghouse. So I think it's expected to work that same way for student drivers. All right, Rob, you're up. What do you got on your list?
All right, I've got drivers can't take over the counter medications.
Can or
Some
can't?
cannot, but you can actually. That's not factual. So you can actually take over the counter medications, and a lot of times what happens is if it's a medication that'll trigger, say it's Adderall, and it causes you to test positive for meth, which obviously you're not on meth, you're on Adderall for ADHD. But what ends up happening is the MRO then has to do their investigation following that positive. And they'll contact you and ask you, are you on any medications? Who prescribed it? What did they prescribe it for? Who was the doctor? Where did you get the prescription filled? What was the prescription? And once they complete that investigation, which I've seen it take a couple weeks, actually, depends on how fast they can contact these places to validate all that. Then, you generally, what we would get back as a carrier is a letter saying, hey, the result is negative, but understand that this Rob Carpenter is operating under Vicodin or whatever the prescription is, which could affect their safe operation of a vehicle. So that's
We
kind
call
of how
these, I call them safety concern letters.
that.
This is a fairly new thing, I think. I think this came about probably 5 or 6 years ago, where MROs started doing this, where they are, because essentially, like Rob said, the process is driver is going to test positive on the initial drug test because of the over-the-counter medication, whatever it happens to be. Obviously not all over-the-counter medications cause a positive drug test. It's only the types that would pop positive on the 5-panel test that we're testing for. But anyway, you test positive on that test. The MRO, the process is the MRO calls you and tries to figure out, is there a legitimate reason for the positive test? If he's satisfied that the legitimate reason is that you are on a prescription that's causing that positive, then he can turn that positive into a negative through the verification process. But sometimes that'll be the end of the story. You'll just get a verified negative if you're the carrier, and that'll be the end of the story. But other times they may say, hey, I'm going to verify it as a negative because it wasn't some nefarious thing. You weren't using illegal drugs. But I still have a concern as a doctor for you operating commercial motor vehicles while using that particular drug. And that's where you get those safety concern letters. And so question for the motor carriers is, what do we do with that? And, that's where the lawyer in me always gets a little concerned because, technically under the regulations, that driver is still able to operate for you. There's nothing, if you get a negative with a safety concern, they're still legally allowed to operate. But the question is, from a risk standpoint, am I comfortable with him still out there operating with a doctor having told me that they're concerned about this driver's ability to safely operate a vehicle on this medication? And I would say in those situations, your answer should be no. You should not be allowing that driver to continue operating with that safety concern letter, because you can be sure that if that driver then gets involved in a bad accident, that letter is going to come out in litigation, and you're going to have to explain why you thought it was okay to continue using them after a doctor told you that it was probably a bad idea to continue using them. So I think at minimum, at least my guidance to our clients usually is, at minimum, if you get that type of letter, you need to send them back to a DOT medical examiner and have them go in for a new DOT medical examination. Take that safety concern letter with them and get a new doctor, a DOT medical examiner, to sign off on whether they are comfortable with them continuing to operate on their med card with that safety concern. Rob, thoughts on that?
No, that was our policy too. I think we'd get these from Todd Semo at High Right, and then it would be like, hey, this driver has this safety issue while he's taking this medication. And it's like, well, now that we know this, how do we put them out there on the, driving our vehicle, and then they get in, some kind of have an accident, then it goes to litigation. The plaintiff lawyer starts asking questions about, did you think it was wise to let them drive with this safety notice, knowing that there was a safety concern? So you're sending them back. We're not medical professionals. We're just DOT people. So we're sending them back to a medical examiner that's in the registry that knows DOT regulations. And if they put them back on there, you kind of have that buffer. Todd Semo may have his MRO office protected, and now you're protected through having another doctor review it. So,
yeah, I think that's best practice for sure. All right, moving on here. Matt brings up another question here, which leads right into one on my list here. He says, I believe you guys have discussed in a prior video about CBD products that are over the counter but may have misleading labels about THC content, which could trip a positive result. Yeah, so on my list, one of the most common misunderstandings in the drug and alcohol realm that I'm dealing with on a pretty regular basis is CBD use among drivers. And like Matt said, we've got a ton of content out there on this issue specifically. But yeah, the misconception is that it's okay for truck drivers to use CBD products. And that's just not the case, because there are literally at this point thousands of instances across the country where a driver has taken some type of CBD product, whether it be in, gummy or drops or whatever it happens to be. And they think that they're okay because oftentimes the label on the package says that it contains little to no THC, which is the psychoactive compound that causes the high effect. And so they think they're good to go. But it turns out that label was inaccurate, and then that driver tests positive on a DOT drug test. And the problem is FMCSA and DOT say, we don't care what the rationale or what the reason is for the positive test, even if it was a legitimate use of what you thought was lawful CBD. We don't care. It's still the same consequences. They've got guidance on the books that says that. It's out there. And that's their enforcement policy, is that if you test positive for drugs, for marijuana, and it turns out that the reason was because you were using a CBD product, doesn't matter. You're still going to have a positive test, and now you're going to be prohibited from performing those safety-sensitive functions because of it. And for that reason, why are we in this situation? We're in this situation because nobody cracks down on the manufacturers of CBD in this country yet in terms of their representations on their packaging. The FDA, believe it or not, has not stepped in to regulate those types of representations on the packaging. And so there's nobody to keep that stuff in check. There's nobody that's cracking down on the manufacturers of those products. So they are just misrepresenting the THC content in their product, and then drivers are unwittingly taking it, relying on those representations, and then they're screwed over because of it. And so we're seeing some class action litigation pop up across the United States against manufacturers of these CBD products for this reason. And so it's a real risk right now that if you are taking a CBD product and you're a regulated driver, that you could test positive on a DOT test, and then you're screwed. So for that reason, I strongly caution drivers and my motor carrier clients that until FDA starts regulating in this space, it's too risky for drivers to use CBD products, in my view. Rob, thoughts on that?
I had the same question coming up, but I mentioned this actually in a post not too long ago because it's the holidays, right? Everybody's going and eating at other people's houses. And I have a friend, Danny Myers. He is a truck driver, but he grows a lot of stuff, and it's CBD. It's supposed to be CBD. So I think it was last year, year before last, he sent me a bunch of brownies for the holidays.
Uh-oh.
I didn't eat them because I don't eat things like that during the holidays because but anyway, I gave some to my mother-in-law, who's the wife of a rabbi.
Oh, no.
And she was high as gas the rest of the night. I don't know how much THC was in them, but I guarantee you, I would have failed a drug test. But anyway, so watch what you eat during the holidays. You don't know what's in the brownies. So,
yeah, good advice. Has she come down from the high at this point?
She did, but she was terribly sick afterwards because she's like, she doesn't eat anything she's not supposed to. So okay. I think it was just a shock to her system, but
that's good news. Okay. All right. We got a little bit more time here. What's next on your list?
I've got hair follicle testing can be used for FMCSA drug testing. And it was one of those fear mongering thing. in the driver circles years ago where they're going to go to hair and they're going to find out that I did drugs 95 days ago or whatever. And that's not the case. So urine and oral fluid are the only two approved specimen types for regulated drivers. Oral fluid we can't do yet, but it is legal as a specimen. It's just there's nobody. We don't have labs that
No
can do that.
labs to test it.
Yeah. So for now, we have urine and oral fluid, but the only one we can actually do is urine. So that's a no on the hair follicle testing for FMCSA drug testing.
Now, with that said, motor carriers can, and many do, voluntarily or on their own authority, test drivers with hair follicle testing. Those are supposed to be non-DOT tests, and if you test positive on one of those, then you're going to be out of that job at that particular carrier, or not eligible for a job with that particular carrier. But because it's not a DOT test, they are not supposed to be reporting that to the clearinghouse when that happens. So just be aware of that. That certainly carriers can use those tests. It's just not recognized as a DOT test at this point. All right. Let's see. Oh, one other thing on the CBD use is kind of a related issue, and it has to do with legalized marijuana. We just put out a video on our YouTube channel. Ohio recently became the most recent state to legalize recreational marijuana use. I think it was the 26th state in the country to do that. And so the premise of our video was, what does that mean for regulated truck drivers that are operating in Ohio? The answer is, I'll let you get out of having to watch our other video here. The answer is it does nothing. It is still unlawful for regulated truck drivers to use marijuana, even if they are in a state that has legalized it for either medicinal or recreational purposes. If you are a regulated truck driver, it is still unlawful for you to use it. And if you test positive on a drug test for marijuana, you're going to be prohibited from operating, regardless of whether it's legal in your state or not. So just be aware of that. And that's going to be the case unless and until the federal government steps in and deschedules the marijuana. It's still a Schedule 1 drug on the Federal Controlled Substances Act. So, all right, let's see here. What else is on my list? Oh, one that I hear pretty commonly is this idea that drivers have up to 2 hours to report for a random drug and alcohol test once they've been notified that they've been selected for a random test. That is not true. Whoever is saying that is conflating a couple of different rules. They are conflating post-accident testing, which has some concrete time frames. If you're involved in a DOT recordable accident that requires drug and alcohol testing, there are specific discrete time frames within which you have to be tested. One of which is you're supposed to be tested within the first 2 hours for alcohol, but you get up to 8 hours if you're not able to get it done within the first 2 hours. So I think that's where folks have pulled this 2 hours from. But in the random context, the regulations very clearly say that as soon as a driver is notified that they've been selected for a random test, they have to report immediately to the testing site to get tested. What does immediately mean? It's not defined in the regulations, but immediately means immediately. So if there's delay in you going to the testing site, it is going to be it should be a refusal, and then you're going to have the same consequences as if you tested positive. Rob, how did you control that when you're working as a safety director for large fleets? How did you control that timing of folks, making sure folks are getting immediately to a testing site once you've notified them?
It was difficult because we had 104 managers that you dealt with at like the frontline level that were really actually interfacing with these drivers every day. So they would schedule the test and then they would notify them, but a lot of times the ball would get dropped. So it was this never ending cycle of training for managers, those 104 managers that oversaw this, because you'd have managers who we would hire, we would train, they didn't really retain it as much as they should have, and they would let a driver know, hey, tomorrow you have to go take your random test before you come into work. And it's like, no, you can't do that. So generally what we would do is mark them unavailable, retrain the manager, and then we would get an alternate in their place. That's not the best way to do it. It's just the way that we had to, under the circumstances. But generally, it's once they scheduled the test, they sent them for it. And you had managers that would manage it better to say, "Hey, I know that this driver's coming in, and what they have to do isn't going to start until 10. We've scheduled them for 8. We're going to send them to get this test done, then send them on their way to work."
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the
a lot.
regulations leave it
Yeah,
up to the carrier to decide what is a reasonable amount of time for them to report. But the longer that gets, the more risky it is for the carrier. That if you allow any significant portion of time to elapse between when you notified a driver and when they reported, you're risking being written up for a violation in the context of an audit if FMCSA were to come in and look at your drug and alcohol testing file. So the quicker the better is always my advice. All right, let's pick maybe two more and then we'll call it a show. What do you got, Rob?
so drivers can avoid testing by using synthetic urine or other adulterants, and that is not. I'm not going to say you can't do it. There's people who try it, but there's um, methods used to detect this. So generally, when we would have this happen, and we actually had this happen a lot in Georgia, in the Atlanta area, when we had different offices in that area, we would routinely get something from the clinic saying, "Hey, something's not right with this. We think it's synthetic. We want to do an immediate observed specimen." So that's kind of how that has always flowed out for me after that's detected. Um, so I don't think it's ever a thing where they actually visibly see them using something they shouldn't. I think it's actually detected, through the process of reviewing the urine and the temperature, pH, etc. So,
Yeah, I
um,
mean, like you said, there are controls in place to weed that out and detect it, and it does get detected. I've had truck drivers call me and ask me, "Hey, can you help me? I purchased some fake urine on the internet and I got caught, and what can I do?" Well, you're out of luck, buddy. Not much I can do for you. Shouldn't have done that. So, yeah, good advice there. All right, I'm gonna give you the last one here.
all right, we've got man, I don't know. I've got like 20 left.
Pick your
Um,
best one.
drivers can never challenge a positive test result, and that's not true. And it depends. On my side of things, when I've managed big carriers, a lot of our drivers were non-DOT. So what we found in the in the oral fluid test on that side for non-DOT, you could still use oral fluid, and you didn't have a split set a specimen to test. So what would happen is if they were positive for that one, yes, you can do it easier. It's faster. The results come back faster, but you don't have a split set specimen. So once they're positive, that's it. There is no challenge to that.
That
But
has
with
changed, by the
DOT
way.
testing,
With the
yeah,
new oral fluid
it
regulation,
will.
there is now a split. But anyway,
Yeah. Now for FMCSA, that's not the case. With urine, you're hey, put this much urine in this cup. We're going to split it into two specimens. If you argue the fact of the positive on the first one, we'll just do the second one. And you have a time frame in there. You can't just come back a month later and say, "Hey, I want to go back and test that month old urine." But you can file a challenge, and then you can go in there and they can retest that second specimen.
yeah, this is a critical point, and this gets so many drivers in trouble. They a lot of times drivers will come to us after the fact and say, "Hey, I legitimately was not using drugs, and the test it was a false positive. What can I do?" You had an option at that point. Your recourse was to request a test on the split specimen. That's your only recourse at that point. And like Rob said, you have a specific time frame within which to do that. The MRO should advise you of that fact when they call to talk to you about a positive result. You should request a test on the split. And if you don't request a test on the split, then you're pretty much out of luck. I've had some drivers try and kind of go the backdoor way of escalating the issue up through FMCSA headquarters. It usually doesn't go anywhere. So the point is there, If that happens to you and it's legitimately, hey, I'm not, it was a false positive, you need to request a test on the split. All right. Anything else? We're about out of time here, Rob.
No, I mean, I'll throw one more out there. I think we got 4 minutes, but once a driver completes a SAP program, they can return to work immediately with no future testing required. And that's not the case. So if you complete your evaluation with the substance abuse professional, you got to do return to duty testing, but then that's going to lead into, or could lead into, follow-up testing for who knows how long. So
up to 5
it's
years.
not as simple. Yeah, not as simple as just going and completing SAP and then, hey, I'm going back to work, 30 days later or whatever. There's some testing regimens that'll follow you for some time.
And those are going to be observed tests, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so the process is you finish the SAP program, the educational part of it. You're still prohibited from operating unless and until you pass what's called the return to duty test. So this will be the first test after you finish the SAP program. It's oftentimes a pre-employment test for a new motor carrier that can also serve as the return to duty test. If you pass that, you can operate. You can legally now operate a commercial motor vehicle. But you are now subject to follow-up testing, random follow-up testing at a certain cadence for a certain period of time. The regulations say the SAP can prescribe a follow-up testing schedule to extend up to 5 years, and many of them are for a full 5 years. And they usually, within the first year, there's going to be more tests, and then they start to kind of scale down over that time period. But there's going to be a long tail to it. And if you're the motor carrier that has hired that driver after they've tested positive, and now that's your problem, those follow-up tests. If you don't do those follow-up tests, if you don't follow that testing schedule to a T, that's a violation on your part. So just realize that for that reason, and because of the highway accident risk, a lot of motor carriers just say, as a matter of policy, we don't hire any drivers who have tested positive in the past. They just don't want to deal with it, and I get it. But it puts drivers in a tough spot for sure. All right. Well, I think we better wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out with us today. I think we covered a lot of ground. Obviously, Rob still had 20 or so more misconceptions that maybe we'll address some of them in the article that we put out. So be on the lookout for that. Like I said, best way to keep up to speed on what we got going on over at Trucksafe is by subscribing to our newsletter over at trucksafe.com/subscribe. Also, if you haven't checked out our online courses, we have several online courses available for trucking company owners, safety managers, drivers over at our Trucksafe Academy, trucksafeacademy.com. Be sure to check those out. Anything else, Rob?
Nope, that's it for me.
All right, we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Talk to you later.